In classical astrology, there's 6 possible conjunctions with the sun. And here is a super quick, super summarized summary of the effects of each one. The moon's conjunction with the sun signifies architecture and engineering. That's interesting. The conjunction of Mars with the sun signifies discipline, enforcement, and military. The conjunction of Mercury with the sun signifies expert talents and intellect. The conjunction of Jupiter with the sun, ethical imposition. Venus with the sun signifies arts, peacemaking, and luxuries. And Saturn's conjunction with the sun signifies metallurgy. Well, obviously, we really need to explore these interpretations in detail to truly understand what it all means. The first step to understanding this is to realize that the sun is not an ordinary planet. So conjunctions with it are a little bit different than conjunctions with other planets. The sun is the sun. It's full of bright, brilliant light. And any planet that comes close to it gets visually obliterated. In other words, you can't see it anymore. This is called combustion in astrology. So to interpret or understand the conjunctions of planets with the sun, we have to take into account the combustion. So you notice on this list that certain planets seem to be doing really well in conjunction with the sun, like Mercury and Venus, while other planets are sort of neutral and others are really not doing great at all, especially Jupiter. So the reason for that is that Venus and Mercury are always close to the sun. They're completely used to the sun's brightness. It doesn't set them off balance or change them much. But Jupiter is completely the opposite. It's very bright, but it's very far from the sun and very seldom gets subjected to this. But really, we should look at each one of these conjunctions individually to explore the nuances of the interpretation and understand the mechanics behind why that interpretation is what it is. Let's start off by looking at the actual source text. This is Paldipika chapter 18, text number 1. Tikmangshu janayat vishesha sahito yantrashmakaram naram bhaume nagaratam buddhena nipunam dhikirti sokyanvitam kruram vakpatinanyakayanitaram shukrena rangayute Labda swangra vijena dhatu kushalam bhandu prakare shuva. So let's use the actual original language, which is quite beautiful, to understand each conjunction separately. And let's go in order from the best to the worst. So we'll start off with Mercury. Mercury's conjunction with the sun is supposed to represent expert talents and intellect. So what's being said in the source material is Nipuna Dhi Kirti Saukya. Dhi means the intellect, which makes a lot of sense when it comes to Mercury's conjunction with the sun, because that's what Mercury represents. Kirti means brilliance. So now you see what I'm saying? Is some planets do well when they get close to the sun. The intellect starts to shine. And then you have the first word, which is Nipuna. Nipuna means talent or expertise. So it's differentiating the scientific type of intellect against Nipuna, which is the artistic kind of intellect. Which is, you get success or Sokya in both fields. And so hence we say that Mercury's conjunction with the sun signifies success in any intellectual and or artistic field. Now, before you go too crazy with this, just do a reality check for a second and realize that Mercury is almost always conjoined with the sun. That's why it's so used to the combustion. So don't be overly inclusive in what you consider to be a Mercury-Sun conjunction. Just because Mercury and the Sun are in the same sign, for example, doesn't really mean you should consider it a conjunction. Look for the conjunctions that are really tight by degree. Another thing I want to mention is you should always remember that the signs in which the conjunction occur affect the dignity of the planets and therefore affect the interpretation of the conjunction. If the conjunction is occurring in signs where the dignity of Mercury and Sun is not that great, then it wouldn't be as great of a version of these results as if it's occurring in signs where their dignity is really good. So this is actually true for any conjunction with any planet. Another thing that's true of any conjunction is that you should also always consider the house in which the conjunction occurs. So the effects of the conjunction will most directly impact the symbolism of whatever house it's in. And that will oftentimes highlight or downplay certain aspects of the interpretation. So for example, if you've got Mercury Sun conjoining in the 5th house, that really highlights the intellectual, the Dikirti. Whereas if it's occurring in the 11th house, that would really highlight the Nipuna, the talent. All right, let's move on and have a look at the Sun's conjunction with Venus. It's supposed to represent the arts, peacemaking, and luxuries. So the way it's phrased in the original Sanskrit is Ranga Ayudhai Labdhasva. Ranga means dance, or acting, or even playing, or even lovemaking. So you can see how appropriate a word it is for Venus. Ayudhai is the opposite of yuddha, or the opposite of war. So it means reconciliation, or peacemaking, or cooperation. So this little phrase here, Ranga Yudhai, is very similar to the kind of English catchphrase like, I'm a lover, not a fighter, or the slogan, make love, not war. The final word in the phrase is labdhasva, which means profit, gain, wealth, and luxuries. So you can take that word independently from the other two, and it would indicate that Venus's conjunction with the Sun is also very good for wealth and luxury. Or you can combine it with the other two words and say that they get their luxuries and wealth through cooperation, conciliation, and artistic talent and romantic things like that. So if we put it all into one neat English sentence, we would say something like, Venus's conjunction with the Sun indicates performance talent, especially for the romantic arts associated with music and dance. Next, let's look at the Moon's conjunction with the Sun. This one is really kind of interesting. Initially, it was very kind of confusing. The Moon conjoined with the Sun signifies architecture and engineering. That seems odd, so how does that happen? Well, the original wording is yantra ashmakaram. Yantra is a popular word, it's a well-known word. It's not necessarily well understood, however, it means machine. But it doesn't necessarily mean a modern machine, it means any kind of machine. So that includes magic. And that also includes things like blueprints and plans and designs. That's why sometimes a design is called a yantra. But really, a yantra is a mechanism or a technology or a technique. Magic is also a technology or a technique. So the Sun's conjunction with the Moon has to do with the yantra. So that sort of makes sense because the Moon is so mystical. The next word, ashmakara, ashma means stone and kara means to make. So somebody who makes stones, a stone cutter or a builder, a construction worker. And if you put the two things together, yantrashmakara sounds like an architect. But again, you don't have to limit your understanding of the word architect to just the modern instance of what we think an architect is today. A wizard is also an architect. Or a designer is also an architect. They're the person who is making the unseen part of what eventually becomes seen. So we can say the Moon's conjunction with the Sun is elusive and subtle methods to obtain concrete goals, as you would see with people like architects, engineers, mystics, or even saboteurs. The key to understanding this is to think about how the Sun interacts with the Moon and therefore what happens when the moon gets close to the sun. Actually speaking, the moon doesn't get subjected to the sun's rays because she disappears before that can happen. So she wanes gradually as she gets close to the sun and then reappears gradually as she leaves. And that is at the heart of the symbolism that is coming out in this interpretation. The moon is going behind the scenes, but not disappearing. So it's like a yantra. It's like a magic trick. She's disappearing, but she's still there. So she's still forceful. And that's why it represents being behind the scenes, being behind the curtains, acting in invisible ways. Now let's have a look at Saturn's conjunction with the sun, which is supposed to represent metallurgy. So the original language for this is Dhatu Kushalam Bhandu Prakarash. Well, Dhatu is a very important word. It means metal, but that's not the fundamental meaning of it. Actually, the meaning of Dhatu fundamentally is fundamental. A Dhatu is a fundamental, foundational building block of anything. If you understand that, now it makes sense to use the word Dhatu when you're talking about Saturn doing something. Because Saturn is all about fundamentals, basic things. Dhatu Kushalam means expertise with metals, hence metallurgy is a general translation. But it also means expertise with the fundamentals. And Kushala also implies felicity, which means happiness with basic things. Now, it really does sound a lot like Saturn's conjunction with something. Bhandu is the horseshoe. But again, horseshoes really illustrate the actual meaning of this interpretation. Nobody cares about the horseshoes except the horse. All we care about is how fast the horse goes and how long it can run for. But Saturn is the one who is building the horseshoe, which means two things. That Saturn is the one who is working on the stuff that other people don't care about. And Saturn is the one who knows what really makes a difference. So when Saturn is conjoined the sun, we can express it in an English sentence like this. The individual will produce and supply the fundamental basic things that people need for everything else that they actually want to do. So you notice that Saturn's combustion by the sun also isn't really that bad. It's pretty good. Why is that? It's because, like Mercury, Saturn is also always dim. Its status or its stature or its condition doesn't really depend too much on its brightness, because its brightness doesn't even fluctuate that much. Now let's move on and look at Mars in conjunction with the sun. This is supposed to indicate discipline, enforcement, and military. The actual wording is very short. Agha Rata. Agha means to hit. Rata means to enjoy. It's very similar to the modern idea of the Fight Club, or that saying of like enjoying a good whipping. It's the finding of enjoyment in hitting things, or even being hit. So is this really bad? It's not necessarily bad. It maybe isn't necessarily good either, but it's kind of just naturally Mars, right? The reason is that the sun is a fiery planet, and Mars is just like that. Mars is also a fiery planet. So when Mars comes close to and conjoins the sun, what you're getting is the fiery Mars that's very masculine coming close to the fiery sun that's very masculine. And so the interpretation is just the amplification of all that masculinity. So we can say in English, Mars conjunction with the sun indicates a strong, forceful, conflict-ready individual who is capable of regulating and punishing others. Again, just a reminder at this point to not forget about the zodiac signs and their impact on the planets via dignity. Also, don't forget about the significance of the house in which any conjunction occurs. Finally, let's take a look at the Jupiter-Sun conjunction, which seems to be the worst. It's supposed to indicate ethical imposition. In the original language is krura, anyakari, anirata. Krura is a very unusual word to mention when you're talking about Jupiter, because Jupiter is typically the opposite of Krura. Krura means cruel or harsh, and Jupiter is usually generous and nice. So the next word, Anyakari, is what they're cruel about. Anyakari means other people's business. Actually, other people's business is Jupiter's normal concern, because Jupiter cares about other people and likes to instruct other people. But it's usually very generous and giving and gracious about it. Here in this case, it's got Krura Anyakari, which means being cruel about how it evaluates other people. And the third word is Anirata, which means ceaseless, or literally never ceasing to enjoy. So Krura Anyakari Anirata means never ceasing to enjoy being critical of what other people are doing and sticking your nose in their business. That catchphrase, sticking your nose, always poking your nose in someone else's business, is basically what Krura Anyakari Anirata means. So for Jupiter, we can express it in English and say Jupiter's conjunction with the Sun symbolizes asserting and imposing your moral principles in a critical and relentless way. Now, why does this happen to Jupiter? Why does Jupiter have such a turnaround from Somya to Krura by the Sun's combustion? The reason is that Jupiter is usually very, very bright and very, very visible. It's almost as bright as Venus, and it's much more visible because it's not as close to the Sun. Venus's proximity to the Sun makes it used to the Sun's combustion. Jupiter's great distance from the Sun makes it more visible usually, but also makes its conjunction with the Sun more unusual, and it's more affected by its dimming and occlusion or combustion. Don't forget what I mentioned already about context being so important for interpreting these conjunctions. The sign that the conjunction occurs will explain or indicate how dignified or undignified you should frame the effects of the interpretation. And the second point of context is the house in which the conjunction occurs. The house will help you identify two things: what part of the interpretation should be highlighted, and what area of life will the interpretation most immediately and directly affect. If you like this video, I think you would love to get one of the reports that I can give you on your chart. If you want to see what is available, please go to my site, victorcara.com, and click into the readings section. I'll put a link directly to it in the description. Also, subscribe or stay tuned somehow or another, because you'll probably also like the next video in this series, which will be about all the conjunctions to the moon. Thank you so much.